As the president of DSCEC, I would like to give a great welcome to Dr. Beals. Dr. Beals is an instructor and course designer in a special education program at Drexel. She specializes in language and literacy acquisition in autism and educational issues and high functioning autism. Dr. Beals is the author of Student with Autism and Cutting Edge Language and Literacy Tools for Students on the Autism Spectrum. She has also written and lectured extensively about evidence-based language technologies for autism individuals and about the rise of pseudoscientific approaches like facilitated communication. DSCEC is happy to have Dr. Beals to host another event that is provided with a wealth of impactful information. So without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Beals.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Again, my name is Katharine Beals. I'm actually a linguist by training, but over the years, I have retooled as an autism linguist and also as someone who focuses on what works in academic instruction and autism. I teach these two classes at Drexel at X558 and at X560. And additionally, I recently published these two books, which are now available to my students and to anyone else who is interested. So today I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction to autism and share with you some of the things that I've learned over the years about language learning and academic learning in autism. And my hope is that you'll come away with a better sense of what autism is and what works in helping these kids meet their academic and linguistic potentials. But first, I want to tell you about where my interest in autism came from. So a couple of decades ago, my son was diagnosed with moderate autism. Moderate is somewhere between high functioning and low functioning. He recently graduated from Drexel, and with a great deal of help from Drexel, especially, I want to put out a plug for the Drexel Autism Support Program and Peg Monahan. He has landed a job with a neurodiverse hiring firm doing what he enjoys and finding it intellectually stimulating. So anyway, in the course of all that, I've had occasion for the last 2 decades to think deeply about autism and about what it takes for autistic individuals to reach their linguistic and academic potentials. So what about the origin of autism itself? This is a picture of the first person ever diagnosed with autism about 75 years ago, Donald Triplett. You can actually read about him in the book In a Different Key, which was published in 2016. And you can see him as an 80-year-old man in a movie based on that book that came out just last year. So that was 80 years ago. But autism has always been with us. If you look for it, you can find historical figures from centuries ago that fit the diagnostic criteria for autism, even though they were never diagnosed with autism. That's because people have only been categorizing autistic symptoms together and using terms like autism for about 100 years. It's not that people with autistic symptoms went unnoticed earlier, but they were categorized differently. Those with milder symptoms might be considered socially eccentric or obsessed with certain narrow interests. And those more affected by autism might have been considered simply as having some sort of significant intellectual impairment. So discovering autism, recognizing the category of autism, required people that had opportunities to observe enough children to find common patterns and to somehow combine social eccentricity, obsessive interests, and certain cognitive impairments into a single category. But until the last century, there weren't that many children concentrated in schools. There weren't schools. And there weren't people that specialized in evaluating these children, i.e., psychiatrists and psychologists. So discovering autism required a bunch of different circumstances. Required the emergence of early education, widespread early education. It required the emergence of a whole new field, psychiatry, and child psychiatry in particular. It required that children with issues raised red flags, especially at school, and then got referred to those new people, those psychiatrists. And then some of those psychiatrists had to start noticing multiple children with similar symptoms and being astute enough to notice patterns in these children. So one of the very first of these individuals, these psychiatrists, was Leo Kanner. In the late 1930s, early 1940s, he observed 11 children, 3 girls and 8 boys, who all shared certain symptoms. To describe these symptoms and those children, he used one of the words that had been floating around the world of psychiatry at the time, autistic. But Kanner was not the only psychiatrist of that time who made these observations. There were several other people, including Hans Asperger of Asperger syndrome. And as they recorded and published their observations, a list of common symptoms began to emerge. Aloofness, especially social aloofness, intense interests, repetitive behaviors, insistence on sameness, delayed or absent speech, and in some cases, what Asperger called little professors, kids with fluent speech who carried on and on about certain technical or academic subjects. But what is autism evolves over time. It's an evolving process, and the definition has changed bit by bit over the years. It has evolved as child psychiatrists and other clinicians have seen more and more children. It evolves as clinicians become aware of additional symptoms that seem to be common in this population, for example, sensory sensitivities. It evolves as some symptoms are found to be inconsistent across individuals, for example, sensory sensitivities, which are common but far from universal, and language difficulties, which, some kids have no language delays. Indeed, some kids are quite linguistically advanced. And it evolves as some symptoms can be explained as secondary consequences of other symptoms. So, for example, language skills, which turn out to be a function of autism severity. And I'll say more about that shortly. And it evolves as clinicians become aware of the heterogeneity of symptom severity. So, for example, different levels of social aloofness occur and different levels of rigidity. These vary widely across different individuals. And finally, the definition of autism evolves as clinicians have trouble drawing consistent distinctions between what is and isn't autism. For example, profound intellectual disability versus profound autism, or ADHD versus mild autism, or mere eccentricity versus mild autism. So some people, for example, claim that Albert Einstein was on the autistic spectrum, on the autism spectrum. So what is our current understanding of what autism is today? One official source is the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, updated most recently in 2022, which is the main reference for the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders in the US. According to the DSM, autism is now a spectrum disorder, which means that there are degrees of how autistic a person can be. This spectrum actually breaks down into 2 spectrums or spectra. One is a spectrum of diminished social communication and social interaction, and the other is a spectrum of what are called restrictive repetitive behaviors. Let's take a closer look at each of these. For the first dimension, the social communication, social interaction, there is level 3, severe, meaning severe deficits in social communication and very limited initiation of social interaction. Level 2, moderate, marked deficits in social communication, limited initiation of social interaction, and level 1, mild, deficits in social communication, difficulty initiating social interaction. So going from level 3 to level 1, we go from severe deficits to marked deficits to deficits in social communication, and from very limited to difficulty with initiating social interactions. As for the second dimension, rigid repetitive behaviors, there also are 3 levels. Again, level 1, severe, extreme difficulty coping with change, restricted repetitive behaviors that markedly interfere with functioning in all spheres. Level 2, moderate, difficulty coping with change, restrictive repetitive behaviors that interfere with functioning in a variety of contexts. And level 1, mild, interference with functioning in one or more contexts. So going from level 3 to level 1, we go from extreme difficulty to difficulty with change, and from restrictive repetitive behaviors that interfere in all contexts to a variety of contexts to some contexts. So what these levels make clear is that the social and rigid repetitive deficits that define autism increase with the severity of autism. But one thing that's tricky about autism is that it boils down to 2 separate sets of symptoms, social difficulties and rigid repetitive behaviors, that seem to be somewhat unrelated. So to really nail down what autism is, it helps to understand what autism isn't. It isn't a general intellectual disability, though there are specific intellectual difficulties associated with autism, and though many kids with severe autism have substantial intellectual disabilities. It also isn't a sensory disorder, though a number of individuals with autism have sensory sensitivities that are sometimes quite extreme. It isn't a motor disorder, though a substantial proportion of individuals with autism have difficulty with fine motor control, for example, cutting shapes out of paper, gross motor control, for example, throwing a ball, and motor planning or planning out complex movements, for example, handwriting, especially cursive, or word pronunciation, especially of tongue-twisting words like lickety-split, for example. And it isn't a language disorder, though a large proportion of individuals with autism have significant delays and deficits in language. On that last note, regarding the language issues in autism, I want to clarify one thing. When talking about language and communication difficulties, it's important to recognize that there is a distinction between language and communication. Language consists of linguistic tools like vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. Communication is more about the use of language, typically in social contexts, for example, in back and forth conversations. And of course, there are other ways to communicate besides language. And as far as autism goes, language is not necessarily impaired. Indeed, we know that there are some autistic people with large vocabularies who speak in fluent sentences and who may never have had a language delay. But across the spectrum, communication, regardless of level of functioning, there's always some impairment, at least in the social context. So communication is the impairment in autism, not necessarily language. Since we're talking about language, this might be a good moment to talk about the use of language when we talk about autism. You may have noticed that I just said autistic people instead of people with autism. And you may have noticed that I teach a class here at Drexel called High Functioning Autism. So as far as autistic versus with autism goes, the various stakeholders are divided. Parents, particularly of lower functioning children, tend to prefer with autism. High functioning adults tend to prefer autistic. These are tendencies, not absolutes. But either way, it's important to use a term that it's impossible, actually, to use a term that satisfies everyone. So I tend to go back and forth. As far as high versus low functioning goes, the alternative language is of levels of support needs. And actually, the DSM discusses both levels of support needs and levels of severity. But some autism advocates say that it's more accurate and more appropriate to talk about autism in terms of support needs, so that instead of discussing autism as mild versus moderate versus severe, or high versus low functioning, we should instead, according to them, discuss autism in terms of low versus medium versus high support needs. But there's a problem with limiting ourselves to support needs as the way to talk about the different levels of autism. And that's because support needs ends up being too general. Now, when support needs are mentioned in the DSM, they're mentioned only in the context of autism-specific factors, i.e., social communication and restrictive repetitive behaviors. But in much of the discourse about autism, the way people talk about autism outside the DSM, people tend to use the term support needs in ways that include factors that aren't autism specific. For example, factors like anxiety, emotion regulation, and skills pertaining to daily living. And so the issue is that many support needs don't correlate neatly with levels of autism symptomology. So you can have high levels of autism symptomology, but be a calm and well-regulated child. You can have low levels of autism symptomology and be highly anxious. You can have medium levels of autism symptomology and not actually need a lot of help with daily living skills. And you can have low levels of autism symptomology and need a lot of help with getting through your daily schedule and daily life. Okay, so that's the argument against using support needs exclusively. What about instead saying level 1, level 2, level 3? So in other words, what about saying level 1 versus 2 versus 3 autism instead of mild versus moderate versus severe, or high versus medium versus low functioning? It's ultimately, I think, a matter of taste and judgment, but one problem with these levels, these numbered levels, is that they aren't transparent to most people. So generally, only people who are familiar with the DSM and or the clinical definitions of autism will know what these terms mean, and will remember that in the context of the DSM-5 and autism, level 1 means mild, not severe or profound. In other contexts, for example, when you're talking about toxicology, people talk about a level 1 toxin, and that's a really severe toxin. So we don't want to confuse autism with toxins, but we also don't want to confuse people. So in contrast, we all know what severe, profound, moderate, mild, high functioning, and low functioning mean. They tend to be more transparent, and they tend to be more transparent ways of talking about autism. Okay, so now let's go back to the core symptoms and take a closer look at the social dimension and the connection to language, which I promised to bring up earlier. So just to go over that quickly, again, according to the DSM-5, we have those 3 levels. Level 3, severe deficits in social communication, very limited initiation of social interaction. Level 2, marked deficits in social communication, limited initiation of social interaction. And level 1, mild deficits in social communication, difficulty initiating social interaction, with social deficits, again, increasing with autism severity. So it turns out there are a few more basic factors that underlie all this. Studies have shown that autistic children are less likely to tune into other people's voices, faces, and eyes, and this is actually evident starting in very early infancy. Studies have also shown that autistic children are less likely to follow another person's pointing gesture or eye gaze. This results in a reduction of what are called joint attention behaviors. Let's take a moment to consider what joint attention involves. So I've got a schematic representation here, and you can see that there's a person on the left looking at the eyes of the person on the right, and then following that person's eyes over to a fish. Basic idea is that if you're tuned into voices, faces, and eyes, you're inclined to notice when someone else's eyes are pointed somewhere and to be interested in what they're looking at and to turn your head or your eyes towards the same thing. The key moment of joint attention is that second step on the right when both of you are looking at the same thing. So reduced joint attention means reduced time attending to the same things that other people are attending to. And so, given the joint attention patterns in autism, the more severe a person's autism is, the less time they spend attending to the same things that other people are currently attending to. A person's patterns of joint attention and attending to voices and faces has serious implications for language. The less a child tunes into voices, faces, and eyes, and the less attention he or she pays to where people are looking or pointing or attending to, the less immersed he or she is in language. And the less linguistic immersion means the less language you acquire. And in fact, going back to joint attention in particular, it turns out that joint attention plays a crucial role in word learning. And I'm going to explain how that works in a moment in detail. But if you're tuned into voices and faces, then when someone calls out a word you don't know, you're inclined to look up at that person, notice where they're looking, follow their eye gaze, and jointly attend to what they're looking at. And in such a context, it's natural to infer that the person is using that word that you don't yet know to refer to the thing they're looking at. And so if you don't already know the word fish, for example, so look at the schematic diagram again. If you don't already know the word fish, it's an opportunity to start learning the word fish. Now imagine thousands of moments like these multiplied across the course of early childhood, because it actually turns out that most of the time, most of the words that typical children learn are not taught to them explicitly. Instead, they learn those words by tuning into other people's speech and paying attention to what those people are looking at when they talk. And in fact, what the studies of joint attention and language show is consistent with this. How frequently young children engage in joint attention behaviors affects the size of the vocabulary that they've acquired months later. And this is actually true whether or not the child is on the autism spectrum. It seems to be something basic or a basic part of the human condition. So what this means is that the autism spectrum is also a language spectrum. That is, how much tuning into voices and faces and eyes depends on how profound the autism. Profoundly autistic means minimally verbal or nonverbal. Mildly autistic means almost fully fluent or fluent, and moderate autism tends to mean reduced vocabulary and grammar. And the same thing goes for language comprehension. More profound autism means more difficulty comprehending language. In addition, the autism spectrum is also a learning spectrum. Where people are on the spectrum affects how much language they learn, and that affects how much verbal information they can take in and make sense of, because verbal information is information that is conveyed through language. Verbal information includes any information that is expressed in words, spoken or written, narratives, explanations, beliefs, arguments, much of the common sense background knowledge and cultural knowledge that non-autistic kids pick up just by tuning into conversations, and a great deal of academic knowledge, including textbooks and literature. And of course, acquiring verbal information, including through reading, depends on language skills, which, as we saw, depends on autism severity. Now, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of information and skills aren't verbal and therefore are not necessarily affected by autism or by autism severity. These include spatial skills, pattern recognition skills, memorization skills, numerical skills, visual skills, musical skills. And here we have a picture of Cody Lee, who's a singer and piano player who is both blind and autistic. So as we can see, autism is complicated. It's a broad spectrum of social language challenges and restrictive behavior, repetitive behaviors. And autism also involves an unusual combination of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. For example, big variations in verbal versus nonverbal skills and knowledge. And on top of that, there are a great variety of traits among individuals on the spectrum, so that, as the saying goes, and those of you who've heard this enough get really tired of it, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And also, many of our common assumptions about autism are wrong. And many of our assumptions about people don't apply to individuals with autism. So let's take a look at some of the common misconceptions. One is that autistic children have no feelings of attachment toward their parents. In fact, many autistic children have strong feelings of attachment to their parents. Another is that autistic individuals are incapable of basic empathy. In fact, many autistic individuals are capable of basic empathy and sometimes even feel quite disturbed, for example, when other people are in pain. Autistic individuals are uninterested in having friends. In fact, many autistic individuals want, often quite fervently, to have friends. Being non-speaking is the same as lacking intelligence. But remember, as we've discussed, many non-speakers have a variety of nonverbal skills, many of them quite impressive. Autistic people are visual thinkers. Some autistic people are visual thinkers, most famously Temple Grandin, who wrote the book Thinking in Pictures, but many are not. They're like the rest of us. Some of us have visual thinking skills, so strong ones, and others of us don't. And in fact, some autistic people have difficulty processing complex visual information. Autism involves a normal child who is locked inside. In fact, the social and cognitive difficulties in autism reflect differences in neurology that are visible through brain imaging. Autism involves a genius who is locked inside. Yes, some autistic people have genius-level numerical or musical or artistic talents, but this is only a small minority of individuals with autism. It's just that it tends to get inflated by sensational and, in some cases, highly misleading news stories. Now, there are some grains of truth in the misconceptions. For example, autistic individuals often find typical expressions of affection to be aversive. For example, hugging, eye contact, enthusiastic praise. All of that can be aversive. The picture that you see here is of a squeeze machine designed by Temple Grandin, which she designed because she was uncomfortable with hugging people, but craved the kind of deep pressure that other people get from hugs. Grandin found that being squeezed by a machine helped to reduce her anxiety. Moving on, while autistic individuals often have difficulty with basic empathy, they do have difficulty with complex empathy, especially when it involves social skills like knowing appropriate ways to respond when someone else is upset or rapidly figuring out someone else's perspective. As far as friendships go, while many do crave friendships, they often prefer what most of us would consider to be atypical or unusual types of friendships. For example, friendships with more intellectual or interest-oriented basis, or friendships with older people or people from other cultures. And while many autistic people aren't visual thinkers, they still often have language and attention challenges that make visual information, pictures and text, more accessible than spoken information is. That's because auditory information like speech comes and goes. while visual information like written words stick around. So you can reread them if you weren't paying attention. Also, if you have difficulties comprehending language, it may well be easier for you to make sense of a visual diagram than of a verbal description. And finally, where autism doesn't involve a normal person or genius is locked inside, there are still many people who do have unlocked cognitive capabilities, especially ones that are locked in because of the linguistic barriers they have to comprehension and communication. And in some cases, those unlocked capacities actually include a capacity to learn language and other verbal information. Indeed, the big question that has driven a lot of my teaching and my research is, what are the most effective ways to teach language and verbal information to students with autism? And in particular, what are the ways to bypass those joint attention deficits I talked about? So one is trying to increase those moments of joint attention, those moments when you and the child are looking at the same thing, because effective instruction so often requires the teacher and the student to be looking at the same thing. So let's take a look at some of what's effective in basic language and basic skills. And the first one I want to mention is this, the techniques of joining the child's, increasing the moments of joint attention. And there really are two ways to do this. One is to direct the child's attention to what it is you want to teach them. And the other is by directing your own attention to whatever the child is currently attending to, and then to use whatever that is as a teaching moment. So both of these are key ingredients to instruction. One of them is more teacher-centered, the other is more child-centered. Promising interventions in autism also include a lot of direct instruction. That's because autistic individuals, by not tuning into the world, miss out on a lot of incidental, informal learning. All that information instead needs to be taught to them directly and explicitly and systematically, step by step, subskill by subskill. It turns out that autistic individuals depend, even more than the rest of us do, on well-organized material and systematic instruction. Clear, immediate feedback is also essential. This is true for all of us, by the way. So a lot of what I'm mentioning here is good for all students. It's just that students with autism, who are often way behind in a lot of things by the time they start undergoing therapy and formal instruction, are especially dependent, and I really want to stress this, on the most efficient teaching and learning methods out there. Another principle that is in that good for all of us, but especially important for autistic individuals category, are drills for mastery, fluency, and generalization. People don't like drills, but as you know, from sports and music, and it's true for academics as well, they're really, really important. And finally, to ensure proper skills generalization to real-world settings, it's important that teaching occur in both formal and naturalistic settings, especially where non-academic skills like social and life skills are concerned. Another important ingredient of successful instruction in autism are activities that call attention to meaning. That comes up in reading, for example, where many autistic individuals are able to decode words, but aren't necessarily aware of what the words mean, even if they read them out loud fluently. In addition, many individuals with autism find face-to-face environments uncomfortable, and in contrast, enjoy working on computers. So where appropriate, computerized instruction is also an option, especially for academic skills and for the more formal aspects of language. Finally, many individuals with autism have specific difficulties with spoken language. And for these individuals, it's important to identify alternative modes of communication that can work for them. Okay, so I'm going to give you some specific examples of some of what I'm talking about. This is an example of the sort of computer intervention with language that has shown some promise in autism. This is the Sentence Weaver, which is a language teaching program I designed originally for my son. That is now part of a study I'm involved with Dr. Vorndren here at Drexel. It uses systematic instruction and systematic feedback to teach the fundamentals of English grammar. And these are some examples of alternative modes of communication for individuals with autism who have trouble speaking, but are able to construct messages using pictures and icons. Now, most of these tools also have, and this is really important to remind people of, alphabetic keyboards or QWERTY keyboards. And there are actually a number of individuals with autism who benefit from this, because a significant number of non-speaking individuals with autism actually are able to type out some basic keywords, even if they have trouble pronouncing them. That's why so many non-speakers love to get on to devices and navigate YouTube. They can actually type keywords to navigate YouTube. One big challenge that many autistic individuals have, and including actually high-functioning individuals who attend general education classrooms, is in reading instruction. So I want to spend a few slides on that because it's so important. So of course, reading is a huge part of school and a huge part of succeeding in school, given all the reading there is, and reading comprehension is absolutely an essential skill. And as I suggested earlier, autistic students may become fluent in decoding words, but not pay attention to the meaning. So some of the most promising intervention strategies out there for reading are ones that call the students' attention to meaning. One way to do that is to have students pause as they read every time they come across ambiguous words, for example, ambiguous pronouns, and then underline them. And then they can try to figure out in the text what those words might refer to. So that's one way to call attention to meaning. And so, for example, if you look at the word they in the sentence, when she added ice cubes to the glasses of hot tea, they broke, they could refer to either the glasses or the ice cubes. And to figure out which one, you have to think about the meaning of the sentence and possibly also its meaning in the broader context of the paragraph that it's in. Another way to call a child's attention to meaning is to have the child think about main ideas versus details versus non-essential details, and then have them use different colored markers or highlighters to highlight these different parts of the narrative. And this method actually has turned out to be very effective in improving reading comprehension in autism. Another important intervention besides calling attention to meaning for reading instruction is to make sure that students have sufficient background knowledge to make sense of the reading. People are realizing now, reading researchers are realizing more and more just how important background knowledge is in reading comprehension. And so here, teachers need to consider all that verbal knowledge that an autistic student may have missed out on during all those years of development as a result of language difficulties and not attending to or engaging in as many wide-ranging conversations as typical children do. Other characteristics of effective teaching interventions and just interventions in general is that they are implemented as soon as possible in the child's development. So ideally, shortly after the child receives an autism diagnosis, and I realize the ideal often doesn't occur, there are long waiting lists. And then the diagnosis, again, ideally happens a couple of years before the child is old enough for school. Again, that's an ideal. There are a lot of kids who are not identified as autistic until much later. Also, ideally, these interventions are as intensive as possible, many hours per day throughout the week. And finally, again, this is an ideal, doesn't always work out. There is consistency and continuity between what happens at home in clinical settings and what happens in school settings. All right, so now let's shift gears and talk about what sorts of interventions to stay away from, because this is as important as knowing which interventions work. There are actually a host of pseudoscientific interventions for autism out there. Autism has long been a magnet for pseudoscience. I can't tell you how many memoirs, miracle cure memoirs there are about this, that, and the other thing. But by far the most problematic when it comes to language learning and communication are various forms of what's called facilitated communication. These go by a variety of names, including supported typing, typing to communicate, rapid prompting method, RPM, intentional pointing, and spelling to communicate, S2C. You can kind of abbreviate the whole thing as facilitated communication or FC. Classic facilitated communication, as it originally emerged, looks kind of like this. You have a facilitator or helper who holds the child's hand or some other part of the body while the child types out letters with an index finger. The problem with this method is that dozens and dozens of studies have shown that it is the facilitator who subconsciously, without realizing it, and that's important, directs the typing, not the person being facilitated, the person with autism. And therefore, it's the facilitator, not the person with autism, who is the author of the messages. In the rapid prompting method, which is this new variant that also is called S2C and a few other things, in this new variant that has become popular in the last 2 decades, the helper, instead of holding the person's arm or hand, holds up a keyboard, sometimes just sits there next to the person over time. But it turns out that this method is just as susceptible to facilitator influence as classic facilitated communication. And that's because, once again, the person being facilitated, the person with autism, is still typing just with an index finger. And so the helper can subconsciously, without realizing it, cue the person by moving a letterboard or by cueing with her free hand. So in this image, which is actually from the movie The Reason I Jump, which is won all sorts of awards from people who don't know enough about autism, unfortunately, the mother moves her hand to a certain position on the letterboard, and then immediately afterwards, the daughter moves her index finger to the same spot. And you can kind of see that in this image. You can see the mother's hand and the daughter's finger are kind of in the same place. If you watch the video, it's clearer. The whole time, by the way, the daughter who's typing a sort of sophisticated sentence with sophisticated vocabulary is actually speaking. So some of these kids can speak. It's just that their language, their spoken language is somewhat limited, but she's saying no more, no more, perhaps indicating that she doesn't actually want to be typing out a message that her mother is directing and that she probably doesn't understand. Besides that, and that's already a problem, there are 2 basic problems with these methods. For one thing, the autistic people are being denied agency and having their communication rights taken away from them. And for another, they're missing out on evidence-based language interventions and evidence-based communication tools. Unfortunately, and this is one reason why I'm bringing this up at this talk, the Philadelphia area is a hotbed of these interventions. We really stand out here in the Philadelphia area. There's a school in Newtown Square that uses the rapid prompting method. There's a clinic in Springfield that provides training in spelling to communicate. There's a charter school in Philadelphia that has a student using S2C who was featured on our local TV station, WHYY, our local public TV station. And the Lower Merion School District has been sued by parents for refusing to let their son use S2C in school. So I've been actively involved in combating facilitated communication and contributing to a website where you can, I have a link there because it's a place where you can find actually gigantic amounts of information, additional information on FC. The site is called facilitatedcommunication.org, and we were actually very happy to see that that domain name was available to us. All right, let's turn back to what does work. And in particular, what is it that makes for an autism-friendly classroom in schools? So autism classrooms are highly structured. I've already mentioned the need for structure in autism. They're uncluttered with minimal distractions. Autistic students, as any of you who work with autistic students, are very prone to distractions. A lot of information is displayed visually. That's important because of the difficulties sustaining attention to fleeting auditory information that I mentioned earlier. The classroom teaching involves that direct, systematic, instruction in the common sense classroom rules that other kids pick up incidentally by attending the conversations, but that autistic students often haven't absorbed by the time they enter school. So they need instruction in the basic classroom rules. The learning material needs to be highly organized. Again, autistic children depend even more than the rest of us do on clear organization. Teacher feedback is clear and immediate, as immediate as possible. The child really needs sometimes to have multiple opportunities to make corrections and get additional feedback. That feedback loop is so, so important. Options for independent work. Children with autism, as we've seen, have unusual patterns of strengths and weaknesses. They may be way ahead of grade level in some areas and way behind grade level in others. So they often need a very customized curriculum, and independent work is one practical way for them to do that in a classroom setting. The material should be academically engaging, as academically engaging as possible. And that's true for everybody, but the issue in autism is that individuals with autism have very specific, often very narrow interests. So where possible, try to tailor the material to their interests. This means that, one of the problems with the narrow interest in autism is the autistic student may not be interested in a lot of the subjects that interest other students. And so this is a challenge for teachers to figure out ways to engage the student who may not be engaged in what's generally going on. Because of their idiosyncratic interests and patterns of strengths and weaknesses, students with autism will also often need alternative assignments and alternative assessments. Because of the organizational difficulties that are common in autism, students with autism often need organizational support. Checklists and reminders, for example, about completing assignments and turning them in. And because of the language difficulties that are common in autism, autistic students often need support for comprehension difficulties. And I mentioned some of those options from earlier, the interventions. And because of the social difficulties that are inherent to autism, students with autism need support for those difficulties. They're really part of the diagnosis. They need anything from explicit social guidance to a buddy who can be a friend and keep them safe from bullies, for example. Finally, because of their difficulties with unexpected changes in routine, students with autism need prior warning about things like fire drills and changes in the day's schedule. Okay, one final consideration that I'd like to close with is what we can learn from autistic people themselves. There are, by now, a number of autobiographies by individuals with high-functioning autism. Obviously, and this kind of goes without saying, to write an autobiography and get it published, you have to be pretty darn high-functioning. You have to be way at the high-functioning end of the autism spectrum, just at that tiny sliver at the very edge. Nevertheless, even though these people are not representative of most of the autism spectrum, they do have some things to say about the challenges of high-functioning autism and what worked for them personally, say in school, for example, that are worth listening to. So I've listed here some of what I consider to be some of the more helpful autobiographies, and those are pictures of the authors. All right, and then as for me, and I'm sort of closing here, I am not a person with autism or an autistic person, but I am someone who's become familiar and intimately with the various topics that I've shared with you. And so you can learn more about what I've been up to and what I've talked about through my courses. Anybody who wants to can sign up for my course, as far as I'm concerned, my courses, or you can, of course, read my books. And right now, you can ask me questions, and I've also provided my email address. And so thank you all for coming and listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beals, always giving us some good information to ponder on. If anyone has any questions, they can go ahead and pop it in the chat, and I'll read it off to Dr. Beals for review. Or any feedback or anything. I do appreciate you guys coming to join us tonight on this lovely evening of perfect weather outside. So Dr. Bills, we have a question from Kristen is asking, is there any info or opinions on Gestalt, I guess, language learning?
Jasper, is that what it is?
It's Gestalt.
Gestel. Oh, Gestalt, I think is what that is. My understanding is that it's not research-based and doesn't make sense linguistically. I have tried to investigate exactly what is involved in it, and it's very hard to even tell exactly what it is. So I have some concerns about that. I think it's based on the idea that a lot of kids are echolalic, and that means they memorize whole phrases, and you somehow try to work with that. But really, language consists of building blocks and rules, and the way to teach generative language, where you can ultimately form your own sentences, isn't by looking at whole sentences, but by learning how to build up your own sentences rule by rule.
Dr. Cano, I think you have some feedback you can provide in regards to this question.
Dr. Beals, I was actually not going to respond to that question, Sarah, but thank you for unmuting me. Dr. Beals, thank you for the presentation. Very well done. I really appreciate that. I asked Sarah to unmute me so I could express my appreciation for your presentation as well as your instruction in the program. I really find it helpful in the last series that you and the other ABA faculty did was really exciting and encouraging, and I'm happy that you were talking about the evidence-based interventions that are out there and those that are not yet evidence-based.
Thank you.
I have a question because we're talking about autism. Kathy Lord just printed a paper looking at the tools that are used and expressing their concern that the tools that are used to diagnose autism are perhaps just one of the pieces of data that we should collect as clinicians experienced with working with individuals and assessing folk, that the tools not be the primary data point for diagnostic evaluation and classification. There's another piece of data out there that suggests that we have missed a significant portion of women on the spectrum, and that currently right now, I forget exactly what the ratio is, but 1 out of every 10 young women with autism are captured, and the other 9 are not until their adulthood, if I recall the data correctly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you think, or if where we are in sort of our understanding of that, like to the extent that autism was generally thought of as a male disorder, it's possible that the tools could have been developed to assess autism in males and therefore been biased in their creation, right? That's possible, I suspect. I also suspect that the tool was created based on based on males with autism, and so it was looking for those symptoms and not looking for a different presentation that might be common in a female presentation, which resulted then in us missing a significant portion of that population. Or do you think that the incidence of autism might be increasing in the female population, or a combination of all the above, which is always sort of the answer to questions like those, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really complex. And I think, so where I see actually the biggest male bias is not in the ADOS and the other tools that are standardly used, which actually the ADOS involves a tea party. I suppose you could say, well, maybe the boys aren't as good at doing the tea party as the girls, but where I really see the bias is in that autism quotient test that Simon Baron-Cohen developed, where it's all about auto mechanics and clock mechanics, and he's tapping into stereotypical male autism interests, and we have to be very careful when we start getting into interests. So that would be a concern. I thought it was really interesting when I went and reviewed Connor and his initial observations, because there were 3 girls. There were 3 girls and 8 boys. And so that's a pretty good, that's a pretty good balance compared to the 4-to-1 that we often hear about now. So I don't know. And then I think the other thing that your question touches on is, what about the increase in autism overall? Like, what is going on with that? And some people think that there's something going on with probably not vaccines at this point, maybe something in the environment, maybe there's something toxic in the environment, maybe it's older dads, maybe it's premature births and so on. But I think there's also a good candidate, certainly according to David Mandel, who's local, that it's just diagnostic reassignment. And possibly also not just reassignment, where you have people with intellectual disabilities getting reanalyzed as autistic now, but and I had a little graph of that in the slides, but also I think possibly more, and this might more relate to girls, more identification at the milder end. And then you get into all these like complex questions like, well, what does it really mean to be autistic? If there's a female protective effect that prevents girls from looking as autistic, then are they as autistic? What does it really mean? So yeah, I don't know, it gets very, very complicated, but Connor at least had a reasonable proportion of girls. I do think that there probably is some sort of X or Y linked thing going on too that makes it more salient in boys. That's just a guess, right? I'm not a geneticist.
Thank you, Dr. Beals. I have 2 more questions for you very quickly. Megan wants to know, what is your take on ABA therapists using 1, 2, 3 prompts to make students answer immediately versus auditory processing time?
Oh, that's a little bit out of my my lane, I would say, but I think it's important to give people time to respond, and it's also important to build fluency, right? So one of the most promising frameworks for intervention that I became aware of in the course of my research is this precision teaching, which involves ultimately trying to get kids to respond faster and faster. So some people have criticized ABA actually for focusing more on accuracy and not enough on fluency. But I mean, you need to allow kids enough time to respond, I think, and you need to, if your goal is speed, you need to gradually increase or decrease the response time window, but you can't just, I don't think it's useful to only give the child a small window and then you tell them the answer. I don't think that's a good way to teach.
Right, thank you. And our last question is from Shalon. She wants to know if you have any suggestions on how to work with multilingual learners with autism.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that it's important to stress that ultimately learning multiple languages is a good thing and shouldn't be discouraged. So what's tricky, I guess, is you have to decide what language the therapy is going to occur in, and if you want, if it makes sense for the therapy to be in the home language, then sometimes it can be tricky finding a therapist who's good and knows the language, right? We actually had to deal with that with my son because he was he is profoundly deaf. So sign language was the first language that we used, and so we had to kind of find people that were appropriate there. He has a cochlear implant now, so he speaks. Anyway, so I think that's the challenge. I think it's good to have multiple languages generally. Possibly it's overwhelming for some kids to do everything at once, and then you have to make decisions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Beals. Thank you all for coming, and Dr. Little is just going to close us out really quick before I let you guys go. I'm going to try to unmute you again. Go ahead, try again.
Thank you. It's terrible of you. Anyway, I just want to thank you, Dr. Beals. This is amazing again, and thank you for letting us record this. I know that that was a question that DSCEC had before, because there were so many students and PACEC and other folks who wanted to attend and just weren't able to do so. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for your time and all this great information. We really do appreciate you supporting DSCEC with your time and your expertise. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. It was a wonderful opportunity to talk to everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We will let you go. I'll get the recording out to you guys by tomorrow. Once I get the link, I'll shoot it over to everyone that attended and RSVP to the invite. So have a lovely day, and we'll chat with you guys soon.